When I found out the Homeowners Association was secretly taking 1,700 acres of my family's farm, which we've had for generations, I decided to show them who is in charge of their water. What would you do if you found out your neighbors were taking everything you've worked your whole life to create? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The morning was great for planting, clear blue skies, and a light wind to stay comfortable. I was on my tractor before the sun came up, just like my grandfather taught me 30 years ago. My phone kept ringing, but I didn't answer. Nothing was more important than planting these seeds. My family has had this 2,000-acre farm for 4 generations, and planting in the spring can't wait. Not even for mad neighbors. The new housing area had only been there for 8 months. My farm had been here since 1892. The letter said I had to stop all farming within 500 feet of their property line in 48 hours, or I'd be fined $200 every day. I laughed. They had no power over my land. I threw the letter away. The next morning, I woke up to a car door slamming. A woman in a neat white suit was walking across my yard with a clipboard, followed by 2 men in polo shirts with the Willow Creek logo. "Mr. Johnson," she said as I stepped onto my porch, "I'm Sarah Peterson, president of the Willow Creek HOA. We need to talk about your violations." I crossed my arms. "There's nothing to talk about. Your HOA has no control over my property." Sarah's fake smile stayed put. "Actually, according to the county, your farming exemption ended last year. Your property is now part of our community rules, as stated in the Town Law Section 42.3. That surprised me. My property taxes hadn't changed. "My family has farmed this land for over 100 years, I said. "No HOA can suddenly take control." Sarah's smile turned mean. "Times change. We have rules now. Our residents paid a lot for homes with guaranteed property values." She gave me another paper. "This is an official order to stop. The board voted to enforce these rules." As they left, my cousin Bill called. He lived in Willow Creek and was on the town council. "They've been planning this for months," he warned. "Something weird is going on. Sarah's been having secret meetings with builders and changing meeting notes after they're approved." For the next week, I kept working my fields, ignoring the increasingly angry letters. Then came the noise complaints to the sheriff, who sadly explained he had to respond to each one. "Look, Mike," said Sheriff Davis, an old-school friend, "I know this is crazy, but they're complaining every day. They even started a petition saying your farm is a problem for the public." I couldn't believe how fast things were getting worse. "Dave, my family has been feeding this county longer than that development has had roads. What's really happening?" He lowered his voice. "I shouldn't tell you this, but there was a private meeting last week. County commissioners, some builder from the city, and the HOA board. They're pushing for some big project. That afternoon I saw strange men in suits walking on my eastern fields, taking pictures. I drove my truck over to them. "Can I help you? You're on private property." A tall man in a fancy suit held out his hand. "Robert Miller, Greenfield Development. Just looking at the land for planning." "Planning for what? This is my farm." Miller looked confused, checking his tablet. "According to our papers, Greenfield bought 1,700 acres from Willow Creek 3 weeks ago. Construction starts next month for the new Willow Creek Shopping Center and apartments." My heart almost stopped. "That's impossible. I never sold my land." He showed me the documents on his tablet maps of my eastern fields with official county stamps and signatures. The owner listed was Willow Creek Community Trust. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice shaky. "No mistake, sir," Miller replied. "Maybe you should contact Willow Creek. The sale was finalized last month." I rushed home and got my property deeds from the safe. Everything looked okay, but something was wrong. I called the county recorder's office. "I need to check the current ownership of my property," I explained. The clerk took my information. "One moment, sir." The silence was too long. "Mr. Johnson, there seems to be an ownership change from 6 weeks ago. According to our record, most of the property, about 1,700 acres, was transferred to Willow Creek Community Trust. You only own the main house and 300 acres around it." My hand started shaking. "That's impossible. I never signed anything." "The documents have your signature, sir. Do you want me to email you copies?" I looked out my window and saw Sarah in her fancy SUV parked at the edge of my property, talking on her phone and staring at my house. When she saw me, she smiled and waved. The bulldozers would arrive in 4 weeks. I had less than a month to figure out how the HOA had stolen my family's land and stop them. I stood frozen as the surveyor's words hit me hard. My land sold without me knowing? Impossible. "There must be a mistake," I said, showing him the property maps I kept in my truck. "This has been Thompson family land for over a century." The surveyor scratched his head. "Look, I just go where they tell me, but these coordinates match what Willow Creek gave us." My hands shook as I drove to the county records office. The clerk, Mrs. Rivera, had known my family for years. "Frank, I was going to call you," she said, looking worried. "Someone filed new property documents last month. I thought it was strange, but everything seemed official." She showed the records on her computer. My stomach dropped. Official papers showed 1,700 acres of my farmland now belonged to the Willow Creek HOA. Only the 300 acres around my house were still mine. "This is fraud," I whispered. "These signatures aren't mine." I called an emergency meeting with my lawyer, Sam Green. "This is the craziest land theft I've seen in 30 years, Sam said, looking at the documents. "But they covered their tracks well. The paperwork says your grandfather sold development rights a long time ago, and they're just using them now." "That's ridiculous. My grandfather never would have." "I know," Sam nodded. "But fighting this will take time. They've already sold to builders who probably didn't know the sale was illegal." I couldn't wait. The HOA had their monthly meeting that evening, and I was going. The Willow Creek Community Center was busy when I walked in. Sarah Peterson sat at the center table, looking like she belonged on a TV show, not running a neighborhood group. The room went silent when people saw me. "This is a private meeting," Sarah said coldly. Richard Thompson, the treasurer, adjusted his glasses nervously. "We don't know what you're talking about." Sarah's fake smile didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe you should check your family records more carefully. That land was included in our development zone from the beginning." Richard slid some papers across the table. "It's all legal. The sale is final." I glanced at the documents, more fakes showing land boundaries that had never existed. "My family has the original deeds from 1892, I said. "These papers are fake, and you know it." "That's a serious accusation," said Janet Miller, another board member, who looked confused. Sarah assured us this was all proper. A retired police officer who worked part-time security moved toward me. "Sorry, Frank, just doing my job." As I was led outside, my neighbor, Tom Baker, followed me to the parking lot. Tom had moved to Willow Creek just a year ago, wanting the rural life that was now in danger. "They've been planning this for months," he whispered, looking nervous. "Secret meetings talking about expanding the community." "Why didn't anyone tell me?" I asked. Sarah threatened anyone who spoke up. Jeff Winters questioned it last month and suddenly had $5,000 in HOA fines. They can make people go bankrupt if they want to. I drove home feeling lost, my family's history crumbling around me. The farm that had fed the community for generations was about to become identical houses and shopping centers. Unable to sleep, I pulled out my grandfather's old wooden chest. Among birth certificates and old photos, I found it. The original water rights agreement from 1943. The document explained how my grandfather had allowed a reservoir to be created on our property, which now supplied water not just to our farm, but to the whole area, including Willow Creek. I read further, my excitement growing. The agreement had specific rules. Farming would always have first priority for water, and the rights were tied to the original homestead, the 300 acres I still legally owned. At dawn, I called Sam again. "They might have stolen my land with fake papers," I said, "but they forgot something important." "What's that?" Sam asked, yawning. "Who controls their water?" Sam was silent for a moment. "Frank, be careful. This could get bad." "They started it," I replied. "I'm just ending it fairly." After hanging up, I saw a bulldozer on my eastern field. Construction was starting already. Through binoculars, I could see Sarah standing with men in suits, pointing at my best wheat field. I opened my laptop and started researching water rights, easements, and local rules. If they thought they could push around a simple farmer, they were about to learn how wrong they were. That afternoon, I visited old Mr. Patterson, who had maintained the county's water systems for 40 years before retiring. "Of course, I remember that system," he said, showing faded blueprints on his kitchen table. "Your granddad was smart. The main control is right here, on your remaining property. Always has been." I took photos of the blueprints with my phone. "What are you planning, Frank?" Mr. Patterson asked, his eyes sharp. "Just making sure I understand my rights," I replied. That night, as I walked my property line, watching the lights of Willow Creek, I made my decision. I wouldn't just fight for my land. I would show Sarah and her corrupt board exactly who they were dealing with. I picked up my phone and made 3 calls. First to Sam, then to the local newspaper, and finally to the State Water Authority. The game was about to change. What I didn't know was that Sarah had just hosted a champagne party for select HOA members and builders, promising them that construction would be finished within a year, their property values would go way up, and that ugly farm would finally be gone. They didn't know what would happen when they turned on their water the next morning. The sound of bulldozers tearing up my family's farmland woke me at dawn. I rushed outside in my pajamas to find huge yellow machines destroying the soil that had fed our community for generations. My stomach dropped as I watched crops being destroyed. "Stop! You can't do this!" I shouted, waving my arms. The workers ignored me, continuing as if I wasn't there. I felt sick. "This land grows food for thousands of people. You can't just turn it into luxury homes." "We already did," Sarah laughed, showing me her phone screen with a picture of huge houses where my cornfields once stood. "The papers are signed. The county approved the zoning change last week." As she drove away, she purposely splashed mud onto my boots. I stood there, hands shaking with anger, watching years of hard work disappear under the bulldozer tracks. My neighbor Emma called that evening. "Have you seen what they're posting online? The HOA is bragging about their purchase all over social media." I read it carefully, then read it again. A slow smile spread across my face. At sunrise, I called my old college friend, Sarah, now a water rights attorney. "They didn't do their homework," she confirmed after looking at my documents. "Your family owns the water rights to the entire valley. The agreement only allows others to use it if it doesn't interfere with farming needs." I knew exactly what to do. By noon, I was at the County Water Authority office, filing paperwork. The clerk's eyes widened as she processed my request. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "This will affect hundreds of homes." "I'm very sure," I replied calmly. "I'm changing the water allocation, as is my legal right." 2 days later, I was eating breakfast when my phone started buzzing with notifications. Facebook messages, texts, and voicemails poured in from Willow Creek residents. Their water had slowed to a trickle, then stopped completely. Sarah called 17 times before I answered. What did you do?" She screamed so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Nothing illegal," I replied, buttering my toast. "I simply used my water rights as stated in the agreement. The document says I can prioritize farming use." "People need water to live," Richard shouted in the background. "People need food too," I countered. "I'm redirecting all water to my remaining 300 acres. I'm increasing production there since you stole the rest of my farmland." Sarah's voice turned sweet. "Listen, maybe we moved too quickly. We can discuss some payment." "The time for talking was before you faked documents and stole my property," I interrupted. "Now I'm just protecting what's left." I hung up and walked outside. The sun felt good on my face as I checked the irrigation system I'd modified. Water that once supplied the entire valley now flowed only to my remaining fields. An hour later, 3 police cars pulled up my driveway. Sheriff Miller stepped out first. I'd known him since high school. "Got complaints about water tampering," he said, looking uncomfortable. I handed him my documentation. "Everything I've done is legal. My family has owned these water rights for over a century." While he reviewed the papers, a news van arrived. Sarah must have called them, thinking they'd take her side. The reporter, Julie Ramirez from Channel 5, approached me with a microphone. "Can you explain what's happening with the water supply?" she asked. Julie's eyes lit up. She clearly saw a bigger story than a water problem. By evening, the HOA called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but my neighbor Tom texted me updates. "They're freaking out," he wrote. "Developers stopped construction. They're threatening to sue the HOA for lying. Property values are already dropping." At 11:42 p.m., my doorbell rang. Sarah stood there, her perfect makeup messed up, her confident posture gone. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Turn the water back on. People have children, elderly parents. They can't stay in homes without water." I leaned against the doorframe. Sounds serious. Maybe they should be angry at the people who caused this. "We can talk about payment," she offered desperately. I looked her straight in the eyes. "Payment isn't enough. I want my land back." Sarah's face hardened. "That's impossible. The contracts are signed." "Then I guess we have nothing more to discuss," I replied, starting to close the door. "Wait," she cried out. "The developers, they might be willing to reconsider if there's a water issue. I can set up a meeting." I paused, thinking about her offer. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m., my kitchen table. Bring the developers, your lawyer, and all those fake documents you used to steal my land." As Sarah hurried back to her car, I noticed lights on in every house in Willow Creek. Nobody was sleeping tonight. They were all wondering the same thing. How had they never questioned where their water came from? My hands shook as I entered the courthouse. Cameras flashed. Someone had told the local news about our fight. The judge had rushed our hearing after 3 days without water had left Willow Creek in chaos. Some families had checked into hotels just to shower. The courtroom was split. On one side sat Sarah and the HOA board members, in their fancy clothes, looking sure of themselves. On the other side were my supporters, farmers in work boots and practical clothes who relied on my land. "All rise," the bailiff called, as Judge Martinez entered. Sarah smirked at me. She thought she had this won. She didn't know what was coming. My lawyer, Miss Rodriguez, started by showing aerial photos of my family's farm, dating back to the 1950s. "Your Honor, this land has been farmed by the same family for over 130 years, she explained. "I'd like to enter into evidence the original land grant from 1892. Sarah's lawyer jumped up. "Objection! Old documents are irrelevant. We have a modern legal sale agreement signed just last month." Judge Martinez frowned. "I'll determine what's relevant. Continue, Miss Rodriguez." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. I watched Sarah's face closely. For the first time, I saw worry in her eyes. Her lawyer presented their sale documents, which looked impressive and official. But Miss Rodriguez was ready. "Your Honor, we've had these documents examined by 3 separate experts." She handed a thick folder to the judge. "They've identified at least 7 signs of document tampering, including digital manipulation of the property boundaries." The judge frowned as he flipped through the pages. "These are serious allegations." "There's more," Miss Rodriguez said. She nodded to her assistant, who wheeled in a cart with 5 boxes of documents. "We've subpoenaed the bank records of the HOA board members." Sarah's face went completely white. Richard, the treasurer, started sweating. "These records show unusual deposits to personal accounts of 5 board members within 48 hours of the land sale," Miss Rodriguez continued. "Deposits that match exactly 2% of the sale price, divided evenly among them." The courtroom erupted. Judge Martinez banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! I will have order!" During the chaos, I watched Sarah turn to Richard, her face twisted with rage. She was looking for someone to blame. "We need a recess," her lawyer demanded. "These allegations are completely unfounded, and we need time to prepare a response." The judge agreed to a 30-minute break. As people filed out, I stayed seated, trying to calm my racing heart. Tom slid into the seat next to me. "You're winning," he whispered. "Half the HOA members look ready to throw Sarah under the bus." In the hallway, I overheard Sarah and Richard arguing. "You said this was foolproof, Richard," he hissed. "Now we're facing criminal charges." Sarah's perfect mask finally cracked. How was I supposed to know his family had some ancient water rights document? Nobody reads that fine print. "Well, somebody should have," Richard snapped. "The developers are already talking about suing us for misrepresentation." I pretended to check my phone while listening. This was better than I'd hoped. They were turning on each other. When court resumed, the mood had shifted. Sarah's lawyer requested a brief consultation with the judge and my attorney. They spoke in hushed tones at the bench for several minutes. Finally, Judge Martinez addressed the court. "Based on the evidence presented, I'm issuing an immediate injunction, halting all development on the disputed 1,700 acres." I let out the breath I'd been holding. It wasn't over, but it was a start. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I'm ordering a full investigation into the documentation provided by Willow Creek HOA. If evidence of fraud is confirmed, this matter will be referred to the district attorney's office." Sarah's perfect posture collapsed. She looked like she might faint. As people began filing out, Mrs. Jensen, an elderly HOA resident, approached me. "I had no idea they were doing this," she said quietly. "Many of us didn't know. We just wanted nice homes." "I understand," I told her. "This isn't about punishing residents. It's about stopping corrupt leadership." The developer representative was waiting for me outside. He looked nervous, pulling at his tie. "Mr. Davis," he said, extending his hand, "I want to make something very clear. We were misled by the HOA. Our company purchased that land in good faith. We had no idea the land wasn't theirs to sell." I studied his face, trying to decide if he was telling the truth. "Your bulldozers destroyed crops that would have fed hundreds of families," I said. He winced. "We want to make this right. We're planning to sue the HOA, but we'd rather work directly with you on a solution." I thought about all the people who depended on my farm. Workers, local restaurants, families. Fighting would take years. Maybe there was another way. "Come out to the farm tomorrow," I suggested. "I have some ideas that might work for both of us." As I walked to my truck, Sarah stormed past, flanked by her lawyer. She stopped when she saw me, her eyes filled with hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You think you've won, but my husband plays golf with the mayor. We have connections you can't imagine." I just smiled calmly. You might want to save your energy for your legal defense, Sarah. I hear fraud charges can be pretty stressful. Tom appeared at my side. The other board members are already talking about holding emergency elections, he whispered. Nobody wants to go down with Sarah's ship. I nodded, watching Sarah's retreating figure. I'd won the first battle, but the war wasn't over. I still needed to get my land back, and Sarah wasn't going to surrender easily. But for the first time in weeks, I felt hope. Sometimes justice does prevail, especially when you control the water supply. You will not believe what happened. 6 months later, I stood in my eastern field as the morning sun sparkled on the crops. The bulldozers that once tore into my family's legacy were gone. In their place, farmers worked the land that had been returned to me, all 1,700 acres of it. The judge had thrown out the fake sale papers and ordered everything back to me. I still can't believe we won, said my wife, squeezing my hand as we looked over our restored farmland. We didn't just win, I said. We changed everything. Sarah and her HOA friends couldn't hide from the spotlight. Camera crews camped outside their fancy houses, asking about the kickback money they'd taken. Richard broke down on live TV, admitting they'd planned the whole thing over secret meetings and champagne. We just thought no one would care about some old farm, he sobbed into the microphone. But people did care, a lot. 3 weeks after the court decision, I got a surprise visit from the developer's new CEO. Their old boss had been fired over the scandal. We made a terrible mistake, she said, sitting at my kitchen table. Our company never would have moved forward if we'd known the truth. I pushed a plate of my wife's fresh-baked cookies toward her. What happens now with your company? She smiled. That's why I'm here. We have a different idea. Would you consider selling just 50 acres legally this time for something that could help everyone? Instead of luxury houses, they proposed building a modern farming facility on a small corner of my property. It would create jobs and process crops from farms all over the county, including mine. Plus, they'd fund a farming education center where city kids could learn where their food comes from. And the Willow Creek HOA? I asked cautiously. They'll have no control over any of this, she promised. In fact, the next HOA meeting looked nothing like the old ones. Tom Baker, my neighbor who'd secretly tried to warn me, had been elected the new president after Sarah and half the board resigned in disgrace. The remaining members voted unanimously to approve my new farming operation and create a buffer zone between our properties. Most of us moved here because we loved the country feel, Tom explained as we walked the property line together. We never wanted to destroy what makes this place special. The criminal charges against Sarah and Richard moved forward. The district attorney had found bank transfers showing exactly how much money had lined their pockets from the fake land deal. Sarah had to sell her big house after her husband divorced her over the scandal. I sometimes saw her driving past my fields, her face pinched with anger. As summer turned to fall, we broke ground on the new processing center. Local farmers came to celebrate, bringing pies and side dishes made from their own harvests. Even residents from Willow Creek joined in, including many who admitted they'd been bullied into silence by Sarah's threats of massive fines. My grandfather was a farmer, one older gentleman from the development told me. I hated what they were trying to do to you. The water rights issue got solved too. We drafted a fair agreement that guaranteed enough water for both my agricultural needs and their households. In return, the HOA bylaws were permanently changed to protect farming activities from complaints. 1 year after our court victory, we hosted a community harvest festival on the very fields that had almost been stolen. Children from both the development and farming families ran through a corn maze together while their parents chatted over apple cider. As sunset painted the sky orange, I found myself standing next to Tom. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if they'd gotten away with it? He asked. I looked across the crowd of people enjoying food grown from this very soil. I think about it every day, but then I remember something important. "What's that?" he asked. "People forget that fancy houses and perfect lawns don't feed anyone. This land doesn't just grow crops, it grows community." Tom nodded thoughtfully. Sarah never understood that. She just saw dollar signs. I spotted my oldest son teaching a Willow Creek teenager how to drive our smallest tractor, both of them laughing. "You know what the best revenge is?" I said, smiling at the sight. "It's watching her drive past every single day, seeing what she almost destroyed not only survive, but thrive, and knowing that while she lost everything, we all gained something better." That night, as my family gathered around our table, filled with food we'd grown ourselves, I realized the HOA had accidentally given me something precious. They had tried to take my land, but instead they'd helped me show an entire community why this farm matters. And that lesson would feed people's hearts long after their fancy development had faded.